The harsh Wyoming sun beat down, turning the dust on the trail to shimmering glass. Olivia Reed felt her knees start to buckle. In her arms, 3-month-old Emma was a fragile, sleeping weight, oblivious to the fact that they were completely, terrifyingly alone. Her husband, Jacob, was 2 weeks gone, buried beside a trail that had promised a new life and delivered only death. Now this town, Willow Creek, was their last chance. A faded newspaper ad for a school teacher was the only reason she was here. It was her only skill, her only hope. But the town shimmered like a mirage, and with every step it seemed to get farther away. Her vision blurred, the ground swayed. Emma stirred, her little mouth opening in a silent cry for food Olivia didn't have. She hadn't eaten in a day, saving every last bit of her strength for the baby. "Just a moment," she whispered, her eyes fixing on a large oak tree just off the road. A patch of shade. A place to rest. She stumbled towards it, her legs screaming in protest. Emma's cry found its voice, a thin, desperate wail that cut through the oppressive heat. Olivia never made it to the tree. Her world tilted, and she crumpled to the ground, twisting her body at the last second to shield the baby from the hard-packed earth. Emma's cries grew louder, sharp and piercing in the sudden silence. "Whoa there!" A deep voice sliced through the air. Through a haze of dust and exhaustion, Olivia saw a pair of worn leather boots. A man knelt beside her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The voice was gentle, but there was an edge to it, something she couldn't place. She struggled to focus, making out a strong jaw and eyes the color of a summer sky. Kind eyes. Or were they? "My baby," she rasped, clutching Emma tighter. The stranger's gaze flickered from the crying infant to Olivia's face, taking in her tattered dress, her desperation. A look of understanding crossed his features, but it was too quick, too practiced. "You're carrying quite a burden there, ma'am," he said softly. He reached out his hands, large and calloused. "Let me carry both." Olivia stared, confused. "Both?" He smiled, a sad, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The baby, and that heavy heart you're bearing." Something in his gaze felt less like an offer and more like a command. She had no strength left to fight, no choice but to trust him. She let him take Emma. The baby, who had been wailing moments before, settled against his broad chest almost instantly. It was unnatural. Too quiet. "Name's Nathaniel Burke," he said, helping Olivia to her feet. "Folks call me Nate." His grip was like iron. "I've got a ranch just outside town. Water in my saddlebag." He didn't ask if she wanted help. He told her what was going to happen. "You and the little one will come with me, get a meal, get some rest." Olivia swayed, his hand the only thing keeping her upright. "Olivia Reed," she mumbled. "This is Emma." Nate just nodded, his eyes scanning the road behind them, then the road ahead, as if he was checking for something, or someone. "Town's a mile off," he stated, lifting her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing. "You're in no condition to walk." He handed Emma back up to her, then swung up behind, his body a solid wall at her back. His presence wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating. "I don't want to be a burden," she said weakly. His voice rumbled next to her ear, a low vibration that sent a chill down her spine. "Everyone needs help sometimes. Today it's your turn." As they rode, a new feeling washed over Olivia, something colder than grief and sharper than fear. It was the chilling certainty that this was no random act of kindness. This man hadn't just found her, he had been waiting for her. The main street of Willow Creek was quiet, but eyes followed them from every window, every doorway. People didn't just look curious. They looked knowing. They nodded at Nate, but their faces were blank. their expressions guarded. It felt like the whole town was in on a secret. "We'll stop at Doc Miller's first," Nate announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. He reined in the horse in front of a small white building. "I can't afford a doctor," Olivia whispered, clutching Emma. Nate's kind eyes hardened for just a second. "Don't you worry about that. John's a good friend. He'll understand." Doc Miller was a gray-haired man with spectacles, but his kindly manner seemed brittle, a thin veneer over something else. He examined Olivia and Emma with an unnerving efficiency. He declared Emma healthy but underweight, and Olivia exhausted. But as he spoke, his eyes kept flicking to Nate, who stood silently in the corner, watching. It wasn't a consultation, it was a report. "Rest, regular meals," the doctor said, looking at Nate, not Olivia. "No worries for at least a week." "She'll have it," Nate promised. And it sounded like a verdict. From the doctor's office, Nate took them to the general store. He left Olivia and Emma on a bench outside, telling her to wait. He returned with supplies and a bottle of milk, his movements efficient and purposeful. "My ranch is about 3 miles out," he said, helping her back onto the horse. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, will have dinner ready. You can stay as long as you need." The phrase hung in the air, sounding less like an invitation and more like a sentence. "Why?" Olivia finally asked, the word scraping her throat. "Why are you doing all this?" Nate was silent for a long moment as the horse plodded along the dusty track leading out of town. "6 years ago," he began, his voice a low, rehearsed monotone, "I came to Willow Creek with nothing. An old rancher, Henry Talbot, took me in, gave me work, taught me everything." His voice softened, but it was a calculated softness. "When he died 3 years back, he left me the place. Said all he asked was that I pass along the kindness when I saw someone who needed it." The story was perfect. Too perfect. A neat little tale of charity and goodwill. But as he spoke, Olivia's hand tightened on the one thing of value she had left. Her husband Jacob's silver pocket watch tucked deep in her bag, and a cold dread began to seep into her bones. She had a terrible feeling that Nate Burke knew exactly who needed his kindness. The Burke Ranch was beautiful, a picture of prosperity with its white-painted house and sturdy barn. But as they rode into the yard, Olivia felt a profound sense of wrongness, like stepping into a painting where all the colors were just slightly off. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, was a plump, gray-haired woman whose smile was as fixed and rigid as a doll's. She cooed over Emma, her movements brisk and efficient, but her eyes were cold and watchful. Within an hour, Olivia had been fed, bathed, and put to bed in a sunny upstairs room. It was all too smooth, too organized. It wasn't hospitality, it was processing. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, her last thought wasn't of gratitude, but of the way Mrs. Abernathy had locked the bedroom door from the outside. The click of the bolt was the last sound she heard. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, but the locked door confirmed her fears. She wasn't a guest. She was a prisoner. A soft knock preceded Mrs. Abernathy's entrance. She carried a breakfast tray, her smile firmly in place. "How are you feeling this morning, dear?" she chirped. The question was a formality. "I need to leave," Olivia said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need to find work in town." Mrs. Abernathy's smile tightened. "Nonsense. The doctor said rest. Mr. Burke insists." She set down the tray. The food was delicious, but it tasted of ash in Olivia's mouth. Nate had already ridden out, the housekeeper explained, to check on the herd, but he had left instructions. Olivia was to make herself at home. She was not to worry about a thing. She was not to leave. Later that day, Mrs. Abernathy allowed her to sit on the porch, but the housekeeper never strayed more than a few feet away, her hands busy with mending, her eyes missing nothing. The peaceful domestic scene was a lie, a carefully constructed stage. Nate returned in the afternoon, his horse kicking up dust. He dismounted with an easy grace, but his eyes immediately sought out Olivia, checking, confirming she was still there. "You're looking better?" he observed. His voice was warm, but his gaze was possessive. Olivia forced a nod. "I need to ask about the school teacher position," she said, trying to sound normal. "I saw the advertisement." Nate leaned against the porch railing, his posture casual, but his body blocked the steps, blocking her only path of escape. "School doesn't start for a few weeks," he said smoothly. "The town council meets next Thursday to interview candidates. Plenty of time to recover your strength." He was stalling. He was isolating her. Emma woke from her nap, and Nate was there in an instant, lifting the baby from her cradle with a practiced ease that chilled Olivia to the bone. Emma, who was usually fussy with strangers, settled in his arms, her tiny hand gripping his finger. "She likes you," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. Nate's smile was triumphant. "We understand each other," he said, looking from the baby to Olivia. "My sister has 4 children. I've had some practice." Another perfect answer to an unasked question. "Where is your family?" Olivia pressed, desperate for a crack in his flawless facade. A shadow, real this time, crossed his face. "Back east," he said curtly. "Haven't seen them in years." And then he changed the subject, his voice hardening just enough to warn her not to ask again. That night, alone in her locked room, Olivia knew she was in terrible danger. Nate's kindness was a cage, and the bars were closing in. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Olivia played the part of the grateful widow, helping Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen, mending Nate's shirts, smiling and nodding at all the right times. But every night, after the bolt slid shut on her door, she searched her room. It was sparsely furnished: a bed, a wardrobe, a small writing desk. It felt unused, impersonal, except for one thing. The desk drawer was locked. It was a small detail, but in her sterile prison it screamed at her. What was inside? Why was it locked? She had to know. During the evenings, Nate would sit with her on the porch, telling her stories of the Wyoming Territory. He asked about her life, and she gave him the same edited version she had prepared for the town council, omitting the painful details of her family's rejection. When she asked him about his past, he would recite the same story about Henry Talbot, the kind old rancher who had given him his start. But she started to notice small things. The way he talked about cattle, it was with the knowledge of a man who had studied it, not learned it from an old-timer. He used terms and spoke of breeding techniques that were new, scientific, things a simple rancher like Henry Talbot was unlikely to know. One evening, she decided to test him. "Henry must have been a very forward-thinking man," she said innocently, "to teach you all these modern ranching methods." Nate's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. "Henry was a smart man," he said smoothly. "He read a lot. It was a plausible lie, but a lie nonetheless." The conviction grew stronger. Nate hadn't been Henry's student. He had been his replacement. But what happened to Henry? The official story was that he died in his sleep, a peaceful end for an old man. Olivia didn't believe it. While Nate was out on the range and Mrs. Abernathy was in the garden, Olivia worked on the locked desk drawer. Using a hairpin from her meager belongings, she jiggled the lock, her hands trembling. It felt like an eternity, but finally she heard a faint click. The drawer slid open. It was empty, except for a small, leather-bound journal tucked into the back corner. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. The first page read, "Property of Henry Talbot." She devoured the pages. The early entries were simple notes about the ranch, the weather, the cattle. But as the dates progressed, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. He wrote about a new ranch hand he'd hired, a charming young man from the East named Nate. At first, the entries were full of praise. "Bright lad," Henry wrote, "a hard worker." Then the paranoia began to creep in. "Nate watches me," one entry read. "He asks too many questions about my finances, about my will." Another read, "He's too friendly with the folks in town, with Doc Miller, with the mayor. They look at me different now." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a story of mentorship. It was a story of a hostile takeover. She flipped to the last few pages. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl. "Nate brought a man to see me today. A man named Jacob Reed from Boston. They spoke of land deeds and investments. Reed seems honest, but Nate, there is a darkness in that boy. I don't trust him." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Jacob. Her Jacob. He had been here. He had met Nate. The typhoid fever that had supposedly taken him on the trail. It wasn't a random sickness. It was an execution. The final entry was just a few words, blotted and smeared. "Nate knows I'm suspicious. He brought me my tea tonight. My hands are shaking. I feel so—" The sentence was unfinished. Olivia slammed the journal shut, her mind reeling. Henry Talbot didn't die peacefully. He was murdered, poisoned. And Nate had used her husband in his scheme, then disposed of him when he was no longer needed. Now he had come for the final loose ends, Jacob's widow and his child. She had to get out. She had to get to the interview for the teaching job on Thursday. It wasn't about a job anymore. It was about finding an ally, a way out. She had to pretend everything was normal, even as the knowledge of what Nate had done burned in her mind. She put the journal back, locked the drawer, and went down to dinner, forcing a smile for the man who had destroyed her life. Thursday came. Olivia dressed in her one good dress, her hands shaking as she pinned her hair. The journal was a toxic secret burning in her mind. Nate offered to drive her to town, to watch Emma during the interview. His kindness was a suffocating blanket. As they rode, he asked, "Nervous?" She could only nod, the word terrified caught in her throat. The interview was held in a small room above the general store. The town council, Mayor Peterson, Reverend Thomas, and 3 other grim-faced men, sat behind a long table. They weren't just interviewing her, they were assessing her. "Your credentials are impressive, Miss Reed," the mayor said, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He asked the question she expected. "How do you intend to manage teaching duties with an infant?" But then the questions turned strange. "This is a close-knit community," Reverend Thomas said, his fingers steepled. "We value loyalty. We trust our neighbors to do what is right. Do you understand the importance of that, Miss Reed?" It wasn't a question. It was a warning. They mentioned the other applicant, Mrs. Winters, the blacksmith's widow. "A local woman," the mayor said, his meaning clear. A woman who knew the rules. As Olivia left the interview, her heart sinking, she saw Mrs. Winters waiting in the hall. The woman was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that Olivia recognized instantly. It was the fear of a trapped animal. Their eyes met for a moment, a silent, desperate exchange of understanding. Both of them were widows. Both of them were at the mercy of this town. And Olivia suddenly suspected that Mr. Winters hadn't died in a simple blacksmithing accident. Outside, Nate was waiting, bouncing a happy Emma on his knee. "How did it go?" he asked. "I think they prefer the local candidate," she said, her voice hollow. Nate frowned, a perfect imitation of concern. "Don't count yourself out yet. This town needs a proper teacher." He was playing a part, and he was playing it perfectly. As they started back towards the ranch, Olivia knew she couldn't return. Not now. Not knowing what she knew. "Actually," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I think I'll stay in town. I have enough for the boarding house. I need to make plans." Nate's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. For the first time, the mask slipped. "That's not a good idea, Olivia," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not well enough. You and Emma will come back to the ranch with me." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The carefully constructed cage had just become a prison with no pretense. He helped her into the wagon, his grip on her arm bruisingly tight. The ride back was silent, the air thick with unspoken threats. As they neared the ranch, Nate cleared his throat, the friendly mask back in place, but his eyes were cold. "I've been looking for someone to help with the ranch's books," he said. "Henry's records are a mess. It's a paying position, of course." It was another hook, another way to bind her to him, to the ranch. He was offering her a job to keep her under his thumb, to give her the illusion of purpose while she remained his prisoner. And Olivia, seeing the trap for what it was, had no choice but to walk into it. "I accept," she said, because the books, Henry's messy records, might just be the one place Nate had hidden the truth. That night, after Mrs. Abernathy had taken Emma and locked the door, Nate led Olivia to the study. The desk was piled high with ledgers and papers. "As you can see, organization wasn't Henry's strong suit," Nate said with a small, dismissive laugh. Olivia's eyes scanned the chaotic pile. This was it, her chance. She had to find the proof she needed to expose him, the evidence that would free her and Emma. She rolled up her sleeves. "Let's get started," she said, her voice betraying none of the terror and determination churning inside her. For hours, she sorted through the papers, Nate sitting nearby, watching her every move. She felt like a mouse being watched by a hawk. She created neat stacks, separating expenses from income, just as she'd done for Jacob in his shop. The familiarity of the task calmed her nerves, allowing her to think. Nate seemed pleased with her progress. "You're a natural at this," he commented. "The ranch accounts haven't looked this organized. Well, ever." He was trying to flatter her, to lull her into a false sense of security. But as she worked, her fingers brushed against a small, hard object tucked between the pages of an old ledger. She carefully maneuvered the book, shielding her hand from Nate's view. It was a key, small and ornate. It didn't look like a key for a door or a chest. It was smaller, more intricate. She slipped it into her pocket, her heart pounding. Later that night in her room, she examined it more closely, and then she remembered something. Her husband Jacob's silver pocket watch. It had a small, almost invisible keyhole on the back, something she'd always assumed was for winding it, though she'd never found a key that fit. With trembling hands, she retrieved the watch from her bag. She inserted the tiny key. It fit perfectly. She turned it, and a section of the watch's casing popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely unfold it. It wasn't a letter. It was a legal document. A deed. The deed to the entire Burke Ranch, hundreds of acres of prime Wyoming territory. And at the bottom, there were two signatures. The first was Henry Talbot. The second, clear and unmistakable, was her husband's, Jacob Reed. They had been partners. Nate hadn't just murdered Henry and stolen the ranch. He had stolen it from her husband, from her. The entire ranch, this house, this land, it was all hers, and Nate Burke was living in it, holding her prisoner after murdering the two men who had owned it. The next day, a letter arrived from the town council. Nate brought it to her, a smug look on his face. He already knew what it said. She had been given the teaching position. It wasn't a job offer. It was another chain. They wanted her in the town, under their control, embedded in their community of secrets. They wanted her to move into the teacher's residence, a small cottage attached to the schoolhouse. It was a smaller cage, but a cage nonetheless. She had to play along. She feigned delight, thanking Nate for his support. "They've asked me to move in this weekend," she said, her mind racing. This was her chance. A move meant a small window of opportunity, a moment of chaos where she might be able to get a message out, to find an ally. "The offer to help with the books still stands," Nate said, his voice smooth as silk. "The residence is only a short ride from here." He wanted to keep her close, to keep her on his leash. As he spoke, he reached for her hand. "I've grown accustomed to having you and Emma here," he murmured. "The house will feel empty without you." The words, meant to sound romantic, were a chilling threat. The house would feel empty without its rightful owner, the woman he was slowly trying to erase. On Saturday morning, Nate loaded her few belongings into the wagon. Mrs. Abernathy fussed over her, packing a basket of food, her false tears a sickening display. The journey to town was a blur of controlled panic. Olivia clutched Emma, the deed a burning secret in her pocket. The teacher's residence was small and clean, but the air was thick with the ghosts of teachers who had come before. Had the last one really left to get married? Or had she learned too much? Nate carried her things inside, his presence filling the tiny space. "I'll come for you on Sunday afternoons," he said, "to work on the accounts." He was setting the terms of her new imprisonment. He was about to say more when Reverend Thomas appeared at the door, his smile wide and predatory. "Ah, Miss Reed. Settling in, I see." Nate used the interruption to leave. "I'll see you Sunday," he said, and the words were a promise and a threat. He was gone, leaving Olivia alone with the Reverend, another one of the town's smiling jailers. The next 2 weeks were a suffocating routine. She prepared the schoolhouse, met the parents, and learned the names of the children who would be her pupils and her witnesses. She was the perfect new teacher, all while secretly planning her escape. On her first Sunday trip back to the ranch, she resumed her work on the ledgers. Under Nate's watchful eye, she found what she was looking for: discrepancies, cattle sales with no corresponding income, purchases of expensive equipment with no receipts. And then, the final piece of the puzzle. In a ledger from 3 years ago, she found a page with Henry Talbot's signature authorizing the transfer of the ranch to Nate Burke. But the signature was wrong. It was close, but it was a forgery. She had seen Henry's real signature in his journal 100 times. This was Nate's work. She now had the deed proving her husband's ownership and the ledger proving Nate had forged the transfer. She had everything she needed. She just needed a way to use it. October brought the town's Harvest Festival. It was a mandatory celebration, a performance of community for the town's captives. Olivia attended, holding Emma close, feeling the watchful eyes of the entire town on her. Nate found her by the apple-bobbing contest, looking handsome and dangerous. "Afternoon, Miss Reed," he said, his smile a weapon. He asked her to dance. To refuse would be to show her hand. She had to play along. Mrs. Abernathy appeared out of nowhere to take Emma, her timing as perfect and sinister as ever. Nate led her to the makeshift dance floor. As they moved to the music, his hand was a brand on her waist. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice a low growl. "No more than you've been avoiding me," she shot back, her fear momentarily eclipsed by anger. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He thought he had broken her. "I thought you needed space," he said smoothly. "To establish yourself here without complications." He was testing her, probing for weakness. The dance ended and he led her back to the others. The sun was setting and the air grew cold. "Let me walk you home," he said. It wasn't a question. At her door, he paused. "Would you and Emma like to come to the ranch tomorrow? Not for work, just a visit." He was tightening the leash again, pulling her back into his orbit. She had to agree. "I'd like that," she said, forcing a smile. As she watched him walk away, she knew she was running out of time. Tomorrow she would be back at the ranch, back in the heart of the monster's den. She had to make her move. Tonight. After locking her door, She wrote a frantic note, summarizing everything she had discovered: the journal, the deed, the forgery. She addressed it to the only person in town who had looked at her with shared fear: Mrs. Winters, the blacksmith's widow. Slipping out into the cold night, Olivia crept through the darkened streets of Willow Creek. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She found the blacksmith's shop, a small house attached. A light burned in the window. With a trembling hand, she slid the note under the door, praying that Mrs. Winters would find it, that she would be brave enough to read it, and that she would believe it. Then she slipped back to her own little cottage, her heart hammering. The die was cast. Now all she could do was wait and pray that she hadn't just signed both of their death warrants. The next morning, Olivia prepared for her visit to the ranch with a sense of impending doom. Every moment felt stretched, every sound amplified. She expected a knock on the door at any second, Nate and the mayor dragging her out. But nothing happened. At noon, Nate arrived in the wagon, his mood infuriatingly pleasant. The ride to the ranch was the longest of her life. Mrs. Abernathy greeted them, immediately taking Emma, leaving Olivia alone with Nate. He led her toward the apple orchard behind the house. This was it, a secluded spot, no witnesses. "Mrs. Abernathy thinks I should be more direct about my feelings for you," Nate began, his voice taking on a soft, persuasive tone. He was launching his final assault, the pretense of a courtship designed to break her will completely. "The truth is, Olivia, I care for you deeply." He spoke of her husband's death, of fate bringing them together. It was a monstrous performance. He was spinning a love story over the graves of the men he had murdered. She had to stay calm to play her part. I don't know what to say," she stammered, feigning confusion and grief. "It's too soon." "I would gladly carry your burdens for the rest of our lives if you'd allow it," he said, his eyes boring into hers. He took her hand. His touch was cold. She pulled away gently. "I need time," she whispered. His expression tightened. He was a man who did not like being told no. But before he could press his advantage, a shout came from the direction of the main road. One of the ranch hands was galloping towards them. "Mr. Burke, there's a fire! In town! The blacksmith's shop is burning!" Nate swore, his attention instantly diverted. It was chaos, a distraction, her chance. While Nate and the other hands scrambled to ride into town, Olivia found Mrs. Abernathy, who was standing on the porch, her face a mask of fury. The housekeeper knew this was no accident. "I need to get Emma," Olivia said, pushing past the older woman. She ran upstairs, not to the guest room, but to Nate's master bedroom. She had searched her own room, but not his. If there was more evidence, it would be here. She tore the room apart, pulling open drawers, searching under the mattress. In a locked box at the bottom of his wardrobe, she found it. A small vial of colorless liquid tucked away with letters. Letters from her own parents. They had been writing to Nate. They had told him where Olivia was headed, about Jacob, about Emma. Her own family had sold her out, delivering her into the hands of a killer. The betrayal was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. But there was no time for grief. She grabbed the vial and the letters. She ran to the guest room, snatched a sleeping Emma from her cradle, and fled the house. She couldn't go towards town. That's where Nate was. She ran for the stables, saddling the first horse she could, her hands clumsy with haste. She mounted, pulling Emma in front of her, and kicked the horse into a gallop, heading away from Willow Creek, away from the fire, out into the vast, unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. The wind was a raw scream in her ears as she pushed the horse harder, the terrain growing rough and unfamiliar. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Behind her, in the distance, she could hear the faint shouts of pursuit. Nate would have discovered she was gone. He would be coming for her. The fire had been a diversion, a desperate signal from Mrs. Winters, but it had also alerted Nate that his prisoner was no longer compliant. Now it was a simple, brutal chase. Night fell, a blanket of cold darkness that offered both cover and terror. She had to stop to rest the horse to feed Emma. She found a small ravine, a sliver of shelter against the wind. She huddled with her daughter, the vial of poison and her parents' treacherous letters a cold weight in her pocket. She had the proof, but what good was it if she died out here? The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, getting closer. It wasn't just one rider. It was a posse, Nate and his men. They were fanning out, searching. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped. She looked down at Emma's sleeping face, a tiny, perfect life that depended entirely on her. And in that moment, a new kind of strength flooded through her. She was done running. If she was going to be caught, it would be on her terms. She remounted the horse, but instead of fleeing deeper into the wilderness, she turned back towards Willow Creek. It was a desperate, insane gamble. They would be looking for her out here in the open plains. They would never expect her to run back into the heart of the trap. She rode through the night, skirting the main roads, using the darkness as her shield. By dawn, she could see the town's silhouette against the rising sun. The blacksmith's shop was a smoldering ruin. Smoke still curled into the morning air. She prayed Mrs. Winters had escaped. She didn't ride down the main street. She tethered her horse behind the church and crept through the alleyways, Emma bundled tightly in her arms. The town was quiet, an eerie calm after the night's chaos. Her destination was the one place Nate couldn't touch her without revealing his true nature to everyone. The one place where the whole town would be gathered. It was Sunday morning. She walked through the front doors of the church just as Reverend Thomas was beginning his sermon. Every head turned. A collective gasp went through the congregation. Nate was in the front pew next to Mayor Peterson. His face, when he saw her, was a mask of pure fury. She walked down the aisle, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She didn't stop until she was standing at the pulpit, directly in front of the Reverend. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Reverend," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even her. "But this town has been listening to the wrong sermon for far too long." She held up the deed. "This is the deed to the Burke Ranch. It belonged to Henry Talbot and my husband, Jacob Reed." She held up the forged ledger page. "This is the proof that Nathaniel Burke stole it." She held up the vial. "And I believe this is how he did it." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Nate stood up, his face pale. "She's hysterical, grieving and confused." Mayor Peterson stood with him. "This is a house of God. This is blasphemy." But Olivia's eyes found the townspeople, the ones in the back pews, the ones who looked down at their hands, who lived in fear, and she saw a flicker of something new in their eyes. Hope. "Ask him," Olivia's voice boomed in the silent church. "Ask him what happened to Henry Talbot. Ask him what really happened to my husband. Ask him why he held me and my daughter prisoner in his home." Suddenly, a woman's voice cried out from the back. "He's lying. My husband didn't die in an accident. He made a deal with Nate Burke and then he was gone." It was Mrs. Winters. She was alive. She had survived the fire. She stood, her face smudged with soot, pointing a trembling finger at Nate. "He's a murderer!" Another man stood up, and another. The dam of fear that had held Willow Creek captive for years finally broke. The sheriff, who had been sitting quietly in the back, suddenly found himself facing not one hysterical woman, but a dozen angry townspeople, all with stories of their own, all pointing to the man in the front pew. Nate Burke was surrounded. His power, built on fear and lies, crumbled to dust in a matter of moments. He made a move, perhaps for a hidden gun, but it was too late. The men of the town, the same men who had cowered before him, surged forward and dragged him down. The reign of terror in Willow Creek was over. Months later, Olivia stood on the porch of her ranch. The town had seen to it that the law recognized her and Emma's rightful claim. Nate, the mayor, Doc Miller, and the Reverend were all awaiting trial, their web of corruption and murder fully exposed. Mrs. Abernathy had confessed to everything, including her role in Henry Talbot's poisoning. Olivia had reopened the school, and this time, the lessons were about truth and courage. Emma, now a toddler, chased chickens in the yard, her laughter echoing in the clear Wyoming air. The future was no longer a terrifying unknown, but a wide-open plain of possibility. She had walked into this territory with nothing but a broken heart and a baby. Now she had a home, a future, and a strength she never knew she possessed. She had been forced to carry the heaviest of burdens, but she had carried them, and in the end, she had set herself free. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update.